You're the person everyone calls when things fall apart. You're the one who shows up, who listens, who finds a way to say yes, even when every part of you wanted to say something else. You're easy to be around. You don't make things difficult. And somewhere underneath all of that, there is a weight you can't quite name. A quiet exhaustion that has nothing to do with how busy you are and everything to do with how far you've traveled from yourself. You've probably called it sensitivity, or empathy, or just the kind of person you are. Jung would call it something else entirely. What if the kindness you've built your identity around isn't a virtue you developed, but a strategy you learned so early, under so much pressure, that you stopped being able to tell the difference? What if the version of you that never causes trouble, never asks for too much, never lets the discomfort show, isn't your character at all, but a mask so old it's fused to your face? There's a reason it hurts in ways you can't explain to people. The resentment that surfaces and then vanishes before you can examine it. The anger that arrives out of nowhere and leaves you ashamed. The exhaustion of being good. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, but something deeper. The exhaustion of someone who has been performing for a very long time and has forgotten that it's a performance. Forget what the self-help world taught you to expect here. I'm not going to tell you to set boundaries in 5 steps, or to love yourself more, or to stop people-pleasing as if it was simply a habit you could swap out like a bad diet. That's not what this is. This is Carl Jung, one of the most important psychologists who ever lived, looking directly at the psychology underneath excessive kindness and naming it with a precision that should stop you cold. A hypertrophied persona in the service of fear, not too much goodness, the absence of a self. What you're about to see can't be unseen. Stay with me, and the mechanism underneath your exhaustion, the one that's been running quietly for years, becomes completely visible. The only question is whether you're ready to look at what's been hiding behind all that kindness. There is a version of your history you have never questioned. It goes something like this. You are a caring person. You have always been this way. It is simply who you are. Jung would ask you to slow down at that word, always, because the things we have always been are almost never chosen. They are learned, and the most deeply learned behaviors are the ones we absorbed before we had language for them, before we could evaluate whether they were serving us or saving us. The persona, in Jung's framework, is not vanity. It is not pretension. It is a psychological structure, the face we develop in response to what our environment demands of us. Every human being has one. The problem is not the persona's existence. The problem is when a person becomes so identified with their persona that they mistake it for themselves. When the mask stops being something you wear and becomes something you are. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung wrote that the persona is a mask of the collective psyche, a mask that feigns individuality, making others and oneself believe that one is individual, whereas one is simply acting a role through which the collective psyche speaks. Read the last part of that sentence again. Not a role you invented, a role through which something larger than you, social expectation, family pressure, the accumulated weight of everyone who needed you to be manageable, speaks. The child who becomes excessively kind is almost never a child who chose gentleness from a position of security. They are, far more often, a child who discovered very early that authentic existence carried a cost, that expressing a real need produced anxiety in the people around them, that anger was dangerous, that demands were dangerous, that taking up too much space was dangerous. And so they adapted. They became easy. They became helpful. They became the child who didn't add to the problem. And because this adaptation worked, because it produced warmth, approval, relief in the people they depended on, it calcified into identity. By adulthood, it is no longer experienced as a strategy. It is experienced as character. This is the first thing Jung forces you to confront. The possibility that what you call your kindness has an origin that has nothing to do with virtue and everything to do with survival. That doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. But it does mean that the kindness deserves examination rather than protection. Here is the practice, and it is simple, but not easy. The next time you say yes to something, a request, a demand on your time, an invitation you don't want to accept, pause before you answer. Not to change your answer necessarily, just long enough to ask, where is this coming from? Is there a felt sense of genuine willingness, a real desire to give? Or is there a tightening, a mild anxiety, a background hum of what happens if I don't? That hum is not your conscience. It is your persona speaking. The structure that learned decades ago that your safety depended on your agreeableness. You cannot dismantle what you cannot see. Learning to see it in real time is where everything begins. But identifying the persona is only the first step, because the more pressing question, the one Jung spent his career excavating, is what happens to everything the persona pushes out of the way. Every authentic reaction that gets smoothed over, every no that gets swallowed, every truth that gets softened into something easier to hear. That material doesn't vanish, it goes somewhere. And where it goes determines far more about your life than the pleasant surface your persona has learned to maintain. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Suppression is not removal. This is the premise Jung builds everything on, and it is the premise that most conscientious people spend their entire lives refusing to accept, because the alternative is so much more bearable, that if you swallow the anger gracefully and keep moving, it is gone, managed, proof even of your maturity. The psyche does not work this way. Whatever you push below the threshold of consciousness does not disappear. It relocates. It moves from the place where you can examine it and make deliberate choices about it, into the place where it acts on you without your knowledge or consent. Jung called this region the shadow. Not evil, not pathological by nature, but the sum of everything the ego has decided it cannot afford to be. And for the person whose survival once depended on being easy and emotionally undemanding, the shadow accumulates a very specific and very heavy cargo: repressed anger, unexpressed resentment, the legitimate desire to be seen, not as useful, not as the person who holds things together, but as a full human being with needs that sometimes inconvenience others. You've felt this even if you've never had a name for it. The irritation that surfaces towards someone who has done nothing particularly wrong, who simply asked one more thing of you on a day when you had already given everything. The disproportionate reaction to a small slight that embarrasses you afterward, because you know the intensity didn't match the event. The flatness that descends after long periods of being good, not sadness exactly, but a grey absence, as if something in you has quietly switched off. Jung would recognize all of these immediately. They are not signs of ingratitude or instability. They are the shadow finding the cracks. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung described neurosis as self-division, the state of a psyche at war with itself, because the conscious mind insists on maintaining an image the unconscious refuses to ratify. The person who is compulsively kind is not at peace. They are managing a permanent internal conflict. And the bone-deep exhaustion so many of them describe, the tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, is not the exhaustion of doing too much. It is the exhaustion of that war. When it goes on long enough without resolution, the shadow finds other exits, psychosomatic symptoms, depressions without apparent cause in people who are loved and useful and good to everyone around them, explosive moments that seem to come from nowhere and that the person cannot recognize as their own, because in a sense, they aren't. They belong to the accumulated weight of every authentic response that was deemed too dangerous to express. Resentment is not a character flaw, it is a compass. It points with remarkable precision to the places where your authentic self was asked to make way for your persona. The next time you notice it, the low-grade irritation at a request, the tightening when a particular name appears on your phone, don't swallow it and don't perform it. Sit with it long enough to ask, what was I not allowed to say here? The resentment is not the problem. It is the signal. Your psyche marking the exact locations where the distance between who you are and who you perform has grown too large to sustain. But what gets suppressed doesn't simply wait in the unconscious, static and contained. It acts. It shapes behavior in ways the conscious mind never authorized and often never sees. And nowhere is this more important to understand than in the specific ways the shadow of the excessively kind person causes harm, while remaining entirely convinced of its own innocence. There is a particular kind of damage that only very good people cause. Not the damage of cruelty, which is visible and can be named. Not the damage of selfishness, which at least announces what it is. The damage of compulsive kindness is harder to see, harder to trace, and in many ways harder to recover from, because it arrives wrapped in care, in sacrifice, in the genuine belief of the person causing it that they are giving rather than taking. Jung was precise about this. The shadow is not what you think you're hiding. It is what you don't know you're hiding. And the persona of excessive goodness, precisely because it is so invested in its own benevolence, produces a shadow of unusual density, one that operates through the very behaviors the person considers their virtues. Consider what compulsive kindness actually does in a relationship. It creates an asymmetry. One person gives, absorbs, accommodates, smooths. The other receives, not always comfortably, because something in them registers at a level below language that the giving isn't entirely free, that there is a debt being accumulated even if no one is counting openly. The excessively kind person would deny this entirely. They want nothing in return. They give freely. But the resentment we examined in the last section tells a different story, because resentment is precisely the evidence of an exchange that was never acknowledged, of something given that was not, in fact, free. This is the shadow operating, not as aggression, as invisible debt, as the slow pressure of accumulated sacrifice that begins, over time, to function as a claim on the other person. A claim expressed not through demand, but through disappointment, through withdrawal, through the particular heaviness a person carries when they have been very good for a very long time, and no one has noticed in quite the right way. And then there is the subtler damage. What compulsive kindness does to the people it's directed at. A person who never refuses, never pushes back, never introduces the friction of a genuine disagreement, does not give the people around them the gift of reality. They give them a mirror that only reflects what they want to see. The child raised by a compulsively kind parent learns, without anyone intending it, that they are too much to be disagreed with, that love requires management rather than honesty. The friend who is always accommodating trains the people around them, gradually and without design, to stop considering their needs, not out of malice, because the signal was never sent that needs existed. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung observed that the persona is nothing real. It is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. The person who has collapsed entirely into that compromise does not become selfless. They become, in a precise psychological sense, selfless. And a selfless person cannot offer what real connection requires: the presence of an actual other, someone with edges, with limits, with a perspective that sometimes resists, and in doing so confirms that the relationship is between 2 real people rather than between a person and their own reflection. This is the part most excessively kind people cannot immediately accept. They are not causing harm through what they withhold. They are causing harm through what they perform. The relentless availability, the frictionless accommodation, the endless capacity to absorb. These are not gifts. They are, in Jung's terms, the products of a persona so dominant that the self behind it has been effectively evacuated. And an evacuated self cannot love. It can only function. The practical implication is uncomfortable and specific. Think of a relationship in which you are consistently the accommodating one, where you adjust, absorb, smooth, and rarely, if ever, introduce your own friction. Now ask not what you are giving that person, but what you are withholding from them. The honest disagreement you swallowed. The limit you didn't set because you didn't want to make things difficult. The moment when they needed someone to push back and you gave them agreement instead. These are not acts of kindness. They are acts of self-erasure that masquerade as generosity. And they deprive the other person of something they need more than your comfort, your actual presence. But understanding the damage the shadow causes still leaves the deepest question untouched. Because the real cost of compulsive kindness is not what it does to others. It is what it does to the person performing it. What becomes impossible when you have spent years giving from an account that was never replenished. Because the self that would need to receive in order to give genuinely was the first thing you learned to do without. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Picture the moment someone who loves you asks how you really are. Not the social version of the question, the real one, asked quietly, with genuine attention. And notice what happens inside you before you answer. For most people watching this, there is a pause that has nothing to do with thinking. It is more like a search, a reaching inward for something that should be immediately accessible, and finding instead a kind of fog. You know how you're supposed to feel. You know what would be the right thing to say. But the actual, unmediated, unperformed answer, the one that would require you to know what you want, what you need, what is genuinely true for you right now, that answer is harder to locate than it should be. This is not a small problem. This is the psychological consequence Jung identified at the center of an overdeveloped persona, the progressive erosion of access to the self, not a dramatic collapse, a gradual accumulation of distance. Every time you suppress an authentic response to maintain the image, you don't just lose that moment. You deposit another layer of insulation between your conscious ego and your actual inner life, making it incrementally harder to know what you genuinely feel, want, or need. Do this for years. Do it across every significant relationship and every moment of tension. The distance becomes the default. And eventually, the fog is just what the inside feels like. Jung was unambiguous about what this means for the capacity to connect. In The Development of Personality, he wrote that genuine personality requires fidelity to the law of one's own being, not as a moral prescription, but as a psychological necessity. A person who has abandoned that fidelity does not become selfless in the way the word implies, open and available and freely giving. They become, in a precise clinical sense, selfless, without a self. And what a selfless person offers in relationship is not presence, it is function. This is the distinction that cuts deepest, and it is worth sitting with. Function is reliable. Function shows up, listens, helps, accommodates. Function can be extraordinarily skilled at reading what others need and providing it. But function is not contact. What the people closest to you need, what every human being needs from the people they love, is not your usefulness. It is your reality. The confirmation, delivered through your genuine reactions, your actual limits, your honest responses, that they are in a relationship with a real person and not with a very sophisticated mirror. When you give from an evacuated self, the people receiving it sense something, even when they can't name it. The giving feels somehow weightless. The agreement comes too easily. The warmth is consistent in a way that real warmth, which moves and shifts and sometimes withdraws, never quite is. Something in them registers that they are not meeting you. They are being managed by you, gently and with the best intentions, but managed nonetheless. And over time, the relationships built on this foundation develop a particular quality, intimate on the surface, strangely lonely underneath. The practical question this raises is one most excessively kind people find almost impossible to answer without discomfort. What do you actually want? Not what you're willing to accept. Not what would make things easier for everyone. What do you want? From this relationship, from this situation, from this particular moment. If the answer doesn't come quickly, that difficulty is itself diagnostic. It means the persona has been doing the answering for so long that the voice underneath it has grown faint. And a faint self cannot give genuinely. It can only perform generosity, which is not the same thing, and which the people on the receiving end can feel even when they can't articulate why. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes not an abstract psychological ideal, but an urgent practical necessity. Individuation, the process of becoming, consciously and deliberately, who you actually are, is not selfishness. It is the precondition for genuine giving. You cannot offer real presence to another person while you are simultaneously evacuating yourself to maintain their comfort. You cannot love honestly while you are managing the impression you make. The self you have been suppressing in the name of kindness is not the obstacle to connection. It is the only thing that makes connection possible. Which brings us to the question the entire video has been building toward, and the one that is, in practice, the hardest to answer. If the persona must loosen, if the suppression must end, if the self must be recovered and brought back into contact with the world, what does that actually look like? Not as a therapeutic abstraction, as a specific, concrete change in how you move through your days and your relationships. That is what the next section is about. Most people who recognize themselves in everything described so far arrive at the same question, and they want it answered quickly. How do I stop? How do I set the limit, say the no, reclaim the self? And the speed of that question is itself part of the problem, because it treats what Jung identified as a profound psychological transformation as though it were a technique to be acquired, a habit to be replaced with a better one. Jung had a word for what actually needs to happen: individuation. And it is worth being precise about what he meant, because the word is frequently softened into something it isn't. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not the optimization of your existing personality toward a more functional version. In The Development of Personality, Jung wrote that genuine personality requires obedience to the law of one's own being, something closer to a calling than a choice, not a decision you make once and then execute, a process you enter, reluctantly and often painfully, because the alternative, remaining split between who you are and who you perform, has finally become more unbearable than the risk of being seen. That distinction matters, because the change Jung is describing does not begin with behavior. It begins with something interior, a shift in what you are willing to know about yourself. The excessively kind person does not transform by learning to say no more often. They transform by becoming honest, first internally and then gradually in the world, about what is actually true for them, what they feel, what they need. What they have been pretending for years does not exist. The practice is less dramatic than most people expect. It does not start with a confrontation. It starts with a pause, used not just to identify whether a response is coming from the persona, but to ask what the authentic response actually is, and to give it some form of expression, even if initially private. Write it down. Say it aloud in a room where no one can hear you. The point is not to immediately deliver every suppressed truth to the people in your life. The point is to stop the erasure at the source, to make the authentic response real to yourself before deciding what to do with it. A self that is never acknowledged, even privately, is a self that continues to disappear. The second shift is in how you understand the purpose of a limit. The persona-driven person experiences limits as rejections, as evidence that they are selfish or less loving than they want to be. Jung's framework reorients this entirely. A limit is not a withdrawal of care. It is an act of honesty that makes genuine care possible. When you tell someone what you cannot or will not do, you give them something endless availability never could, the truth of who they are actually in a relationship with. Real people, with their edges and their refusals and their needs that sometimes inconvenience others, are the only ones capable of real love. The most difficult shift is in your relationship to disapproval. The persona of excessive kindness was built specifically to prevent it, to make you safe by making you agreeable. This means the first genuine expressions of your authentic self will almost certainly produce discomfort. Some people will not like the change. Some will name it as selfishness or coldness. Jung was clear-eyed about this cost. In The Development of Personality, he wrote that the development of genuine personality is an unpopular undertaking, a deviation that is highly uncongenial to the herd. The people who have benefited from your persona will experience its loosening as a loss. That is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that something real is finally happening. What changes on the day everything changes is not your personality. It is your relationship to your own existence. You stop experiencing your authentic responses as threats to be managed and begin experiencing them as information to be trusted. And a person who can hear what their own interior is saying, who has enough relationship with their own self to receive that information without immediately suppressing it, can, for the first time, give from a place that is real rather than a place that is afraid. That is not cruelty. That is not the abandonment of the people who depend on you. It is what Jung meant by the deepest form of care, the kind that requires a self to be present and therefore requires you to stop pretending that yours doesn't exist. Here is a question worth sitting with and not rushing to answer. If you removed the usefulness, the availability, the accommodation, the endless capacity to absorb what others bring, what would remain? Not as a threat, as a genuine inquiry. Because most people who have built their identity around being good for others have never seriously asked it. The persona answers before the self gets a chance. Jung believed that the unlived life doesn't simply wait. It pressures. It erupts in symptoms, in resentment, in the specific loneliness of someone who is surrounded by people who need them and known by almost none of them. The bondoso demise, the excessively kind, does not suffer from too much love. They suffer from too little self, and the self cannot be recovered through insight alone. It requires something closer to what Jung called fidelity, a loyal perseverance toward the law of your own being, even when that law contradicts what everyone around you has come to expect. This is not a comfortable process. The persona loosens slowly, and the material underneath it, the anger, the grief, the needs that were never allowed to have names, surfaces before it resolves. There will be moments that feel like regression, like selfishness, like becoming someone smaller rather than someone more whole. Jung knew this. He never promised that individuation was pleasant. He only insisted that the alternative, the continued performance of a self you don't inhabit, was a form of dying that happened too slowly to notice until it was very advanced. What remains, when the performance finally begins to soften, is not nothing. It is something quieter and more durable than the warmth the persona learned to project. It is presence, the capacity to be in a room with another person without managing them, to say something true without calculating the damage first, to receive care without immediately deflecting it back toward the other person because receiving feels more dangerous than giving. That is what genuine kindness actually is, not the compulsive variety, which protects no one, least of all the person practicing it, but the kind that comes from a self that is actually there, present, inhabited, capable of contact rather than just function. You already know which one you've been offering. And somewhere underneath the exhaustion, underneath the resentment you've been calling sensitivity and the performance you've been calling character, you know what it would feel like to stop. If what you encountered in this video opened something in you that isn't finished yet, the video on your screen right now continues exactly where this one left off. Click and keep watching.